Okay, ambivert. I found this absolutely fascinating. I have for years, back when I was, literally when I was a kid, my best friend's father was a psychologist. I've told this story. I'm not going to tell the whole story on the air. It's been a few years, but of how we tortured our teacher once, convincing her, actually the school psychologist, convincing her that we both gone crazy. But I was fascinated by things, and this is like when I was 8, 9, 10 years old, and I was fascinated by stuff like the Myers-Briggs test, and Carl Jung, and I remember reading Freud and graphing out. I must have been 9 or 10 years old. I couldn't have been over 10. Graphing out the superego and the id and the ego and all this stuff, and trying to understand it. And the one thing that always kind of stuck with, that I got stuck with, that I couldn't figure out, was introvert, extrovert. In the Myers-Briggs test, it's one of the 4 letters. You say I'm a such and such, and one of them is introversion versus extroversion. And generally in our society, we define introversion as, just broadly, kind of pop psychology, as people who are quiet, and extroverts as people who are loud. That's actually not how psychology views it. Carl Jung, who invented the term, invented both words. Carl Jung suggested that the difference between introversion and extroversion was that introverts they defined themselves by an internal mechanism. So they looked inside themselves and said, okay, this is who I am. And then they conduct their lives based on that. Whereas an extrovert would conduct their lives based on who other people tell them they are. So this is Carl Jung's theory, right? This is 150 years old. And so, and his theory was that about 100 years old, was that it has to do with, and this is why extroverts tend to be loud and out there, is that they're constantly saying to people, tell me who I am, tell me who I am, tell me who I am. And so extroverts tend to end up in fields where they're visible, like being on radio or TV. Introverts tend to be bookkeepers. Okay, this is kind of the conventional wisdom. I never felt like I fit in any of those categories. If anybody asked, I would always say I am an introvert who knows how to pretend he's an extrovert, because I calibrate myself by an internal. I have no doubts about who I am. I don't need people to constantly reaffirm it or confirm it. It's nice when somebody calls up and says, "Hey, Tom, you're doing a great job." But who wouldn't mind that? But that's not what I live for. That's not why I do this show. I have peers, I have friends in this industry who I know that's what they live for. It's the only reason they're doing it, is they want the recognition, the fame, the fortune, all that kind of stuff. The fortune I wouldn't mind, but the recognition of the fame, I'm okay with or without. And yet I can also perform. Now, part of it is that I was so kind of introverted that when I was 20 years old, maybe 21, I took a Dale Carnegie course, which was a public speaking course, and you had to read Dale Carnegie's books, How to Win Friends and Influence People, and how to stop worrying and start living, as well as his book on public speaking. And then you had to give 2 speeches a week for 14 weeks, and it changed my life. And then I joined Toastmasters to keep up my skills, and I learned how to do public presentation. And I strongly recommend Dale Carnegie and Toastmasters to anybody who has to interact with the public in any way at any time in your life. It's great skill building. But anyhow, this article was in Huffington Post by Dr. Travis Bradbury, President and Emotional Intelligence 2.0 co-author. And he suggests that, we've been thinking about this wrong. Now, I started saying this in regard to ADHD. I was saying that ADHD is not, you're not on or off. It's not all or nothing. You're not, ADD or not ADD. That there's actually a spectrum there. And some people are way out on the edge of that spectrum, so much so that they're dysfunctional, that they can't really function in society. Other people are, way out on the far other end of the spectrum, so non-ADD, that they have a hard time functioning. But everybody else is kind of in the middle of this kind of bell curve distribution. We now talk about autism that way, the autism spectrum. Well, he's suggesting that that there's a spectrum to introversion and extroversion, and that the vast majority of people are not introverts or extroverts, that they're what he calls ambiverts. That is, they have, it's a kind of like as in ambidextrous, you can use your right hand or you can use your left hand. Well, this would be, you have the ability to be, step into the role of an extrovert or to step into the role of an introvert. And he said, here are the things that, if you answer these questions, yes, you're an ambivert. I can perform tasks alone or in a group. I don't have much preference either way. Social settings don't make me uncomfortable, but I tire of being around people too much. Being the center of attention is fun for me, but I don't like it to last. Some people think I'm quiet. Others think I'm highly social. I don't always need to be moving, but too much downtime leaves me feeling bored. I can get lost in my own thoughts just as easily as I can lose myself in a conversation. Small talk doesn't make me uncomfortable, but it does get boring. When it comes to trusting other people, sometimes I'm skeptical, and other times I dive right in. If I spend too much time alone, I get bored, yet too much time around other people leaves me feeling drained. And I answer yes to all of those. And he says, if you answer yes to all of these things, then you are actually right in the middle. You're an ambivert. And I'm like, oh, wow, is that cool? But it's not part of the Myers-Briggs test. We've got to have binary opposites. We've got to have polar extremes in our society and in psychology. So I just thought that was fascinating. I wanted to share that with you. And Paul in Chicago. Hey, Paul, thanks for listening to WCPT. What's on your mind?
You were talking about the ambiversion. And
yeah.
I've been a consultant for many years with an instrument called the Forte communication style profile. And term ambiversion was, I believe, was created by Dr. C.D. Hoop Morgan, who founded and runs the Forte Institute.
Okay.
The idea of it, and what's happening is I was a consultant for many years doing the Forte and doing this. It's sort of a competitor with Myers-Briggs.
Mm-hmm. So there's a personality profile, basically, that's used by business?
See, that's the thing. We try to distinguish the Forte as being more of a communication style profile rather than a personality profile.
I see.
The personality profiles get into very, very different things. Communication style. See, the concept of the Forte is that you're constantly adapting. See, Myers-Briggs kind of typecasts you, and that's the way you are.
Right.
NFP or whatever you are
right.
in Myers-Briggs. With Forte, what you have two tests you take. The first one is the primary profile, which is the common way you communicate with people. Then there's the adapting profile, and your surroundings, your environment, is continually forcing you to adapt to different situations.
So it's as in the word forte, preference or ability or strength.
Is measuring your strength.
Yeah.
So the idea of the Forte is if you take the Forte from work, you'll have a different adapting profile than you will from home.
Sure.
Or in other situations. So the concept of the ambiversion is interesting because I did this for many years not realizing had I looked at my own father and gotten him to take the test before he passed, he was an ambivert. The idea of an ambivert is someone who shows the context of both, and I'll email you like a Forte report so you can see how this looks. But the idea is someone who seems outwardly to be introverted sometimes and extroverted sometimes. So my father was the perfect ambivert. He would go to parties, he'd be the life of the party. And then at some point he'd disappear. And my mother would look around for him and find him in the library in somebody's house reading books.
Yeah.
And the idea of an ambivert, they can handle that part of extroversion for only a certain point. Then they have to go and recharge their battery.
Oh, I'm just exactly like that. In fact, I can't stay at a party or a cocktail party or reception or anything like that, unless I have to be. Occasionally I do these things for my radio stations and things. But after about 20 minutes, I'm burned out.
Yeah, well, my father was he could handle a little bit longer. He'd be a bartender at a party, and he'd just be telling jokes and everything. And again, I said he'd disappear. And it never occurred to me to match what I was doing with consulting with my father's own behavior. And
yeah.
Unfortunately, I never got him to take the test, but I'm sure he would have shown to be an ambivert. What happens is when Forte measures four things: introversion, extroversion, dominance, non-dominance, patience, impatience, and conformity, non-conformity. And ambiversion is one area that shows up in the introvert-extrovert. It shows up a lot more strongly on either side of the spectrum. And the concept of an ambivert is very interesting. That people like that will show this. People will think they're extroverts, and suddenly you'll find them just down.
Yeah.
And again, it's the concept of the battery running down and needing to recharge as well.
Right, and we should distinguish this from bipolar,
Absolutely. This has nothing to do with
behavior. Yeah, this has nothing to do with that.
Communication style and how people adapt their communications to different situations, and also the fortes of measuring how other people view you.
Fascinating stuff, Paul. I look forward to it. And speaking of communication, I gotta communicate with the next caller. It's Paul. Thank you so much for the call, and fascinating stuff. I love it. Carol in St. Paul, Minnesota. Hey, Carol. Thanks for listening to AM 950. What's up?
Oh, hey, Tom. Oh, I find this. Well, I find everything you do fascinating, but the fact that you're bringing up this personality thing. I'm sure you're aware that if a person gets to corporate America, they get administered a lot of tests to see, what's the best fit for them and things like that. And so a number of years ago, and I believe the Myers-Briggs must have changed a bit between the time you took it and I did, because I think it was the Myers-Briggs, because I took a number of them, like what is your color and stuff like that. But they had a category that was called, when I was in the class, they said, well, and you're an introvert, and the whole class gasped because they couldn't think of me possibly as an introvert, but you're an extroverted introvert. So you can get up and you can make that speech, just like the guy that described his dad or the way you describe yourself. You can get up and you can make that speech, or you can hold that training class, or you can do whatever it is you have to do. But the way you get your energy back is not from people. It's from, it's all internal for people that are classified as that introverted extrovert. And so it's nice to know that has, at least there's one thing in the world that hasn't changed.
Yeah.
And I still fit my profile.
There you go. There you go, Carol. Okay. That's what you called about, right?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's a great story. And it's nice to hear from you, Carol. Thank you for sharing that with us. Mark in Aurora, Illinois, listening to WCPT. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Yeah, I'm a first-timer, and I've got still more about the Myers-Briggs phenomenon.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
I have found it most useful to think of it in terms of energy flow, and I finally figured out that I lean towards extroversion by something I call abruptness of pain. It will begin to soak into me that I'm not getting enough alone time if I don't get it for a while. But if I'm alone and I find out about an event with people that I missed out on, suddenly that hurts. And that pretty much said that I lean toward extroversion. However, the surprising thing about me as an extrovert is that I can not only stand, but I love hour upon hour of solitude, listening to radio shows, reading books, listening to music.
Me too.
And I've also heard of what are known as shy extroverts. And that might sound like a contradiction in terms, but I don't really think it is. The one caution that I would want to issue is that each type tends to look down on the other if we're not careful. So I have an introverted friend who says that he wishes his wife were more introverted, because then, she'd be more self-sufficient and she wouldn't be depending on other people for her opinion of herself. But he doesn't seem to realize that she has assets of her own that he does not have. And it works the other way too. If you're an extrovert, it's not cool to criticize introverts for being supposedly not as people-oriented. Introverts often get very much closer and deeper with people than extroverts do.
Yeah, and Jung, in Jung's initial identification of this, and I'm going back on reading that I did probably 40 or more years ago. So
it sounds like you were a precocious child.
Yeah, I was. In fact, I was one of those kids that was identified by, in Eisenhower's program in 1957 and run through accelerated schools and things to the point where I had a summer scholarship to MSU when I was 14. But in any case, now I forgot where I was going, Mark.
Yeah, you were talking about having read about Jung. And
Jung. And Carl Jung, the way that he characterized it was almost as if he was putting a moral value on being an introvert and a lower value on being an extrovert. That extroverts identify themselves through other people, whereas introverts have some sort of internal compass. And I think he was thinking of himself, frankly. Although if you look at Carl Jung's life, there's a lot of extroverted tendencies in there, particularly the attention seeking and the whatever. I mean, I used to be a big fan of Carl Jung. Well, I still am a big fan of Carl Jung, but it's been years and years since I read his autobiography. I'm forgetting the title of it.
Something else in here. How about high self-monitor versus low self-monitor?
Oh, that's a phrase I've never heard.
Well, high self-monitors tend to regulate their own actions by the social cues they pick up, whereas low self-monitors tend to just, say what they think and do what they're going to do without that much reference to what other people might think of it or of them.
So the low self-monitor would be like the classic hyperlexic person, the person who just can't stop talking and shouts down everybody at the party kind of thing.
A low self-monitor, if you want a person to be honest and upfront with you without necessarily sparing your feelings, probably you want to go with a low self-monitor. But if you want to have a person who is going to be very sensitive in managing a party or a wedding reception, you probably want a high self-monitor.
Now, I wonder where those fall on the empathy spectrum and on the autism spectrum.
Yeah, I was just thinking about autistic spectrum and I'm so glad that we're learning new things about autism, because the very etymology of the word suggests being into yourself. And the truth is that autistic people are often so sensitive in the sensory dimension, excuse the redundancy, that they easily go on sensory overload. And it's not that they don't like people, it's that they are so easily overwhelmed by environmental stimuli that they've just got to get away from it. You'll have, I mean, an autistic person, if you were to touch a normal quote unquote person, depending on how well they knew you, they might be a little uncomfortable or they might be okay with it. An autistic person is absolutely overwhelmed. It might feel to them like an electric shock.
Right. This has to do, I believe this has to do with the internal gain system of the thalamus, because all of our sensory nerves, with the exception of smell, pass into the thalamus before they go into the appropriate parts of the brain. And the principal up and down regulator of the thalamus is dopamine. And I wrote a whole, a series of papers. I did a bunch of lectures on this, and it's a chapter in my book, Thom Hartmann's Complete Guide to ADHD, about thalamic gain and how thalamic gain is probably, and I wrote this like 15 years ago, how thalamic gain is probably mediated genetically. And I proposed that it would be the dopamine genes. And now they've actually found that, there's an association between the DR gene, the dopamine receptor gene, the D2 and the D4 genes, so with the 9th and the 11th alleles on D4 and D2, and ADHD and overfocusing syndrome, Farmer syndrome, and which I'd predicted, which is kind of gratifying. But I think that, and I think a lot can be predicted by that. If you add that to Abraham Maslow's theory from the 1970s, that the hierarchy of human needs, I would submit that there was a slice in that pyramid that Maslow overlooked, which is the need to know that you're alive, the need to feel your own aliveness. And people with high thalamic gain, that need is continually met. They don't need to disrupt the world in order to know that they're alive. Whereas with people with very low thalamic gain, they periodically have to disrupt things around them in order to get enough feedback that they get sensory data that kind of wakes them up and says, yes, you're alive. And I think that accounts for a lot of disruptive behaviors and things. But in any case, Mark, I've got to run. The show is over. But thank you for the fascinating conversation. I love this stuff. I could talk it for hours.